The autumn air carried a chill as Carol Watson exited St. Mary's Baptist Church, her heart warm and full from the evening's fellowship. Carol, a retired school principal in her mid-50s, had always been known for her kindness and community spirit. As she stepped out into the quiet night, her worn Bible nestled in her hands, she took a deep breath, appreciating the familiar sights of her small town. She smiled as children dressed in Halloween costumes darted past her, their laughter echoing against the nearby brick walls. "Good night, Sister Carol," called Deacon James from the church steps. "Be safe out there." Carol waved back with a warm smile. "You too, Deacon. God bless." As she climbed into her blue minivan and buckled her seatbelt, she felt a tug of fatigue from the long day. The dashboard clock read 8:50 p.m., and the streets were settling into the quiet hum of nightfall. Carol began her drive home, humming softly to herself, her voice blending with the gentle sound of her tires on the road. Just past the winding stretch near Maple Bridge, Carol noticed a set of headlights swerving erratically in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat. The vehicle, a dark sedan, seemed to zigzag dangerously close to her. She tried to keep calm, gripping the wheel tightly, but as the sedan closed in, her calm gave way to fear. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, bracing herself as the sedan veered directly into her lane. The impact was sudden and violent. The minigun spun, tires screeching as metal twisted and crunched. Carol's head jolted forward, her vision swimming. When the world finally settled, she found herself slumped against her seat, her shoulder throbbing, a warm trickle of blood tracing a line down her forehead. Through the haze of pain, Carol looked back, squinting as she saw the driver of the sedan stumble out, his figure silhouetted against the headlights. Panic gripped her, and years of experience taught her that waiting alone on the roadside wasn't safe. With her last bit of strength, she pressed on the gas pedal, steering the van back onto the road, her destination now the hospital a few miles ahead. As Carol arrived at the hospital, she felt a profound sense of relief. This wasn't just any emergency room. It was the same hospital where her niece, Sandra, had interned as a medical resident years earlier. She felt comforted by the familiar surroundings, though the memory of her niece's stories about certain doctors in the ER made her uneasy. 2 patrol officers helped her out of the van, their faces creased with concern as they noticed the blood trickling from her forehead and her visibly injured shoulder. "Ma'am, let's get you inside," Officer Daniels said softly, guiding her to a nearby wheelchair. As they wheeled her in, Carol glanced around, still dazed but thankful to have reached a place of safety. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly, illuminating a waiting area that seemed half full, the usual hum of an ER at night. The officers handed her over to the intake nurse, who took quick notes and called for a doctor. Minutes passed, then half an hour. Carol's pain grew sharper, but as more patients were seen, her pleas for help seemed to fade into the background. Finally, a tall, lean doctor in a white coat approached. He glanced at Carol with a detached expression before turning to his nurse. "Dr. Miller," the nurse said, her voice hesitant. "Mrs. Watson here was in a car accident. She needs immediate attention for a potential head injury and shoulder dislocation." Dr. Miller's gaze flickered toward Carol, but his expression didn't change. "Is she stable?" The nurse glanced at Carol, hesitant. "Yes, she appears to be stable for now. But then she can wait," he interrupted, his voice cold. He turned to a younger patient, hobbling in on crutches, and gave the teen his full attention. From her seat, Carol's vision swayed. Her shoulder pulsed with pain, and her head felt heavier with each passing minute. She watched as Dr. Miller continued to ignore her, his words blurring as he laughed with the younger patient. She thought of her niece, Sandra, and wondered if she could help her. But before she could reach for her phone, the pain overcame her, and her vision dimmed. Sandra was in the middle of reviewing case files when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing as she saw the unknown number. She almost ignored it, but a gut feeling made her answer. "This is Agent Sandra Watson," she said. "Ms. Watson, this is Officer Daniels with the local police. I'm calling regarding your aunt, Carol Watson. She's at Memorial Hospital after an accident, but, well, she's not receiving the medical attention she needs. We thought you'd want to know." Sandra's heart dropped. "Thank you, officer. I'm on my way." Sandra's heart dropped. "Thank you, officer. I'm on my way." As she hung up, Sandra felt a wave of dread. She knew her aunt, a resilient woman with an iron will, wouldn't have called for help if she didn't need it. And the fact that her aunt was at Memorial, the very hospital where her cousin had shared stories of biased treatment, intensified her worry. She grabbed her jacket, her FBI badge clipped to her belt as she headed out the door. By the time she arrived, her mind was racing, her fear morphing into a steely resolve. Sandra burst through the hospital's emergency room doors, her FBI badge catching the light as she strode forward with a sense of purpose. Her aunt's condition and the troubling words from the officer filled her with both urgency and a simmering anger. She immediately scanned the chaotic ER, spotting Carol still lying on a gurney by the far wall, her head resting against the metal railing, eyes half closed. Her face was pale, and fresh blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage over her brow. Sandra's heart ached to see her aunt like this, but her training kept her focused and sharp. She quickly crossed the room to Carol's side, her hand reaching out to clasp her aunt's cold fingers. Carol's eyelids fluttered open, her gaze slightly unfocused until she recognized her niece. A faint, relieved smile appeared on her lips. "Sandra, honey," Carol murmured, her voice weak. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Don't you worry about that, Aunt Carol. You know I'd come no matter what," Sandra replied, her voice soft but firm. She leaned closer, squeezing Carol's hand. "What happened? Why aren't they treating you?" Carol's expression was a mix of resignation and frustration. "I'm not really sure. They brought me in, took a look, and then just left me here. I think the doctor, Dr. Miller, had other priorities." Sandra's face hardened at the name. She remembered Dr. Miller from stories her fellow agents had shared. He had a reputation for questionable ethics and a less than stellar attitude toward certain patients. Her mind flashed back to her own undercover cases, where prejudice had resulted in dangerous situations, where life-saving help had been delayed simply due to the color of someone's skin or social status. She knew what it looked like, and the subtle signs were all over this. As Sandra scanned the room, she noticed Dr. Miller standing nearby, speaking with a group of interns. His demeanor was relaxed, his tone patronizing as he made a few remarks that had the young students nervously chuckling. Sandra felt her anger simmer to the surface. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of her training before approaching him. "Dr. Miller." Sandra's voice was firm, though not overly loud. She held herself with the kind of authority only experience in the field could grant. The doctor turned, his expression first one of surprise, then barely concealed annoyance. "Yes," he replied curtly, clearly perturbed by the interruption. Sandra held up her badge briefly. "Agent Sandra Watson with the FBI, and Carol Watson is my aunt. She's been lying unattended on that gurney for over an hour. I need to know why her care has been delayed." The color drained slightly from Dr. Miller's face, though he quickly recovered, putting on a veneer of professionalism. "Your aunt is stable, Agent Watson. There's no need for any undue concern. We're handling her case with the necessary urgency." Sandra didn't blink. "The necessary urgency. Dr. Miller, I've been told my aunt was bleeding when she arrived, and that she has a probable shoulder dislocation. Yet no one has given her even the most basic care. Can you explain why she's been left unattended?" Dr. Miller's gaze narrowed, his voice growing colder. "I assure you, Agent Watson, we treat all our patients equally. I have other cases to handle, and your aunt is in no immediate danger." Sandra met his gaze evenly, her tone calm, but layered with an edge. "You may treat all patients equally, Dr. Miller, but the evidence suggests otherwise. My aunt's condition is being ignored, And if it's due to some personal bias, you'll need to reconsider that approach. Now, are you going to treat her, or do I need to bring in more witnesses to make sure her care is prioritized? Dr. Miller's jaw clenched. For a moment, Sandra thought he might turn his back on her, but then he straightened his coat and nodded curtly. "Fine," he said, his voice tight with irritation. "I'll see to her now." He walked briskly over to Carol's gurney, Sandra following closely behind, her eyes never leaving the doctor's movements. He motioned for a nurse, who seemed startled by his sudden demand for assistance. "Mrs. Watson," he began, his tone clipped, "I'm going to need to check your injuries. I understand you've sustained a laceration to the forehead and may have a dislocated shoulder." Carol nodded weakly, wincing as he prodded her shoulder without much care. Sandra gritted her teeth, watching Dr. Miller's every move. As he examined Carol, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, visibly annoyed, and muttered under his breath before returning to his work. "Let's get her to X-ray for that shoulder," he said finally, waving the nurse over, "and start her on an IV to address her blood pressure." Sandra watched him like a hawk as he walked away, and she noticed a subtle shift in the nurse's attitude after he left. She took Carol's hand gently, her demeanor more sympathetic and professional. "We'll take good care of you, Mrs. Watson," she assured her, her eyes flicking to Sandra with a look of respect and quiet acknowledgement. As Carol was wheeled into the X-ray room, Sandra followed closely, her heart heavy with a mixture of relief and anger. She knew the problem went deeper than just one doctor, and she wasn't willing to let it slide. Her aunt deserved proper care, and if there was a systemic issue of neglect based on prejudice, Sandra intended to uncover it. Once Carol was settled in for her X-ray, Sandra stepped outside and made a quick call to her team back at the FBI. Within minutes, she had secured access to state hospital records, including staff complaint logs, disciplinary actions, and patient care incidents tied to Memorial Hospital. She also requested a search into Dr. Miller's professional history, looking for any instances of negligence or reported complaints. As Sandra waited outside the X-ray room, she checked her phone. Her colleague had already sent a preliminary report on Dr. Miller's background. There were several formal complaints against him, 5 to be exact, all dismissed with minimal investigation. Sandra read through each case, her pulse quickening as she noticed a disturbing pattern. All of the complaints involved minority patients who had experienced delays in treatment, dismissive behavior, or unnecessary complications. Dr. Miller's attitude wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern. Sandra knew she was looking at grounds for an investigation into both the doctor and the hospital's handling of his case. The fact that complaints had been dismissed so quickly suggested there was someone higher up keeping his record clean. Sandra was still deep in thought when Carol's X-ray was completed. She quickly returned to her aunt's side as the technician wheeled her back toward the main ER. "Your shoulder's definitely dislocated," the technician informed Carol gently. "But thankfully, there's no fracture. The doctor should be able to set it back in place once he's back." Carol nodded, her exhaustion evident in her face, and Sandra took her hand, offering what comfort she could. When Dr. Miller returned, he barely glanced at the X-ray results before announcing they'd proceed with reducing the shoulder. But as he moved to touch Carol's shoulder, his gaze slipped to Sandra's FBI badge, and he hesitated. It was clear he didn't want to be there. His eyes flickered with irritation as he prepared to set the dislocated shoulder with a curt nod to the nurse beside him. Sandra's instincts flared. She couldn't trust him fully, not after what she'd seen and read. Without another word, she pulled her phone out, opened her camera, and began recording. Dr. Miller looked up, surprise flashing across his face. "Is that really necessary, Agent Watson?" he asked, a hint of condescension in his tone. Sandra met his gaze unflinchingly. "For my own peace of mind, Doctor, I'm here to make sure my aunt receives the same level of care as any other patient." Dr. Miller's jaw tightened, but he didn't protest further. He set her shoulder with practiced movements, And Carol gasped in pain, her face twisting in agony. Sandra felt her heart lurch, but kept the phone steady, capturing everything. She wanted to have undeniable proof of his treatment, or mistreatment, if needed. Finally, the procedure was done, and Dr. Miller stepped back, muttering something to the nurse before walking away without another word. Sandra stopped recording and pocketed her phone, breathing a small sigh of relief as she watched her aunt settle back, finally able to rest without the throbbing pain. But Sandra knew her work wasn't over. She had the preliminary information she needed, and Dr. Miller's dismissive attitude only confirmed her suspicions. Tomorrow, she would initiate a formal request to open a case. She would make sure that Carol, and every other patient who had been overlooked, neglected, or dismissed, would finally see justice. As dawn's first light crept through the hospital windows, Sandra's exhaustion was evident. She had stayed with her aunt through the night, offering comfort and companionship. Carol, although still tired and bandaged, was finally stable, with color returning to her cheeks. Sandra, however, had spent the night organizing her thoughts and crafting a plan of action. Dr. Miller's treatment of her aunt had opened a door that Sandra knew could not remain shut any longer. She had encountered enough discrimination in her line of work to recognize the signs, and she wasn't going to let this slide. Sandra glanced at her watch. Noting that it was barely 6 a.m. still, she needed to move quickly. She sent a message to her colleague Tom back at the FBI office, requesting access to additional records related to medical malpractice in the region. She also flagged her request with a note to escalate it to the Civil Rights Division. This investigation needed immediate traction, and she wanted to secure every piece of evidence before it could mysteriously disappear. Carol watched Sandra work with a quiet admiration. Despite her aches and exhaustion, she could sense her niece's determination, and she knew it was fueled by more than familial loyalty. Sandra was a fighter, and once she committed to a cause, nothing could divert her focus. "Aunt Carol," Sandra said softly, snapping her laptop shut, "I've started the process to open a case against Dr. Miller and the hospital. I want to make sure they're held accountable, not just for what happened to you, but for any other patients who might have gone through the same neglect." Carol gave her niece a gentle smile, though her eyes held a trace of worry. "Sandra, I appreciate everything you're doing, but isn't this dangerous? Taking on a whole hospital. They have money, influence, people who'll protect them." Sandra leaned forward, taking Carol's hand. "I know they do, and that's exactly why this has to be done. Aunt Carol, you're strong, but think about all the people who don't have someone to stand up for them. If we don't do this now, it'll keep happening. Besides," she added with a determined glint in her eye, "I'm not alone. I have the FBI, I have legal resources, and most importantly, I have the truth." Carol nodded slowly, understanding her niece's drive, even if it scared her. "I just don't want you putting yourself in harm's way for me, Sandra." Sandra squeezed her hand reassuringly. "This is for everyone, Aunt Carol. For everyone who's been ignored, dismissed, or made to feel less than. They deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." As the morning pressed on, Sandra made her way to the hospital administration office. She'd arranged a meeting with the hospital's HR director, Leslie Timmons, who had reluctantly agreed to discuss the situation. Sandra knew Leslie would be cautious, but she hoped that her position as an FBI agent might lend enough weight to encourage honesty. The HR office was stark, lined with steel filing cabinets and folders stacked on every available surface. Leslie, a woman in her late 40s with a severe bun and a guarded expression, was seated behind her desk when Sandra entered. She stood and shook Sandra's hand, though her eyes held a trace of nervousness. "Agent Watson," she greeted, her tone formal. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. I understand your concerns about Dr. Miller's treatment of your aunt, but let me assure you, Memorial Hospital is dedicated to providing equitable care to all of our patients." Sandra took a seat, leveling her gaze at the HR director. "I appreciate that, Ms. Timmons, but after what I witnessed with my aunt, I'm concerned that Dr. Miller's actions reflect a broader pattern. I'd like to know more about the complaints filed against him, specifically regarding any allegations of discriminatory behavior. Leslie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, adjusting her papers as if searching for the right words. I'm afraid most personnel records are confidential, but I can tell you that Dr. Miller has a lengthy tenure here. He's highly respected by many of his colleagues and patients. Sandra leaned forward, her voice firm. Respect is earned through fair treatment, Miss Timmons. I've reviewed his file, and I know there have been multiple complaints lodged against him, most of which were dismissed without proper investigation. This isn't about a single case. It's about a potential pattern of bias. I'm here to get transparency on that. Leslie's composure cracked, her eyes darting to the closed office door before leaning in. Agent Watson. Off the record, yes, there have been complaints. And yes, some of them involved concerns about his conduct with minority patients. But Dr. Miller is well connected. The board has always opted to resolve the issues quietly. Sandra noted the resignation in Leslie's voice. Are you saying the hospital has prioritized protecting Dr. Miller over patient safety? Leslie sighed heavily, nodding. It's not something anyone says aloud, but yes. Dr. Miller's family has been a major donor to the hospital for years. He's considered untouchable. Sandra's hands clenched, her resolve hardening. Thank you for your honesty, Miss Timmons. This situation won't be resolved quietly. I'll be taking this information to the proper authorities, and I'll be gathering witness statements from staff who've experienced or witnessed Dr. Miller's discriminatory behavior. I suggest you cooperate fully when they come calling. Leslie's face paled slightly, but she nodded. Understood. I only ask that you keep my name out of it if possible. I have my job to think about. Sandra gave a curt nod. I understand, but know that your cooperation today will be noted. It's the right thing to do. Sandra returned to Carol's room, where her aunt was sitting up in bed, sipping a cup of tea. Seeing Sandra's grim expression, Carol set her cup down, bracing herself. You didn't find good news, did you? Carol asked, her tone soft. Sandra shook her head. I didn't. The hospital board's been covering for Dr. Miller. He's untouchable here, thanks to family connections and donations. This is a lot bigger than I thought. Aunt Carol. Carol's expression was troubled but calm. I've always known some people get away with things others can't, she said quietly. But Sandra, if you're going up against them, you need to be careful. I don't want you getting hurt over this. Sandra took her aunt's hand again, the weight of the moment settling between them. I have to do this, Aunt Carol. They've ignored the voices of countless patients who were too afraid to speak up. If I can put an end to this, if I can prevent even one more person from going through what you went through, it'll be worth it. Carol nodded, her hand gentle on Sandra's. Then do what you have to do, honey, but promise me you'll stay safe, and don't let their darkness take away your light. Sandra smiled softly, her aunt's words grounding her in a way only family could. I promise, Aunt Carol. And thank you for giving me the strength to fight this. Sandra spent the rest of the day gathering testimonies. She approached hospital staff, nurses, orderlies, and even junior doctors who had worked with Dr. Miller. Many were hesitant, glancing nervously around to make sure they weren't being overheard. But a few, emboldened by Sandra's FBI badge and her no-nonsense demeanor, began to share their experiences. A young nurse, Leah, was particularly candid. Dr. Miller, he's not just rude. He's dismissive. I've seen him ignore Black and Hispanic patients, telling them they're exaggerating their symptoms. Just last month, he misdiagnosed a patient with severe pain as just anxious. She turned out to have internal bleeding. They only caught it after she nearly died. Sandra took notes, her heart sinking with each new story. A pattern was emerging, a tangled web of discrimination and negligence that had gone unchallenged for years. The staff who spoke up did so with hesitation and fear. Sandra assured them of her confidentiality, knowing how precarious their positions were. Many were supporting families, relying on their jobs at Memorial to make ends meet. She could see the quiet bravery in each of them as they recounted incidents they'd seen, each one painting a more disturbing picture of Dr. Miller's character. By the end of the day, Sandra had collected enough information to fill a small notebook. She had testimonies from 6 staff members who had witnessed Dr. Miller's blatant disregard for minority patients. She also had evidence of complaints filed against him, most of which were quickly dismissed by the administration. Each new piece of information strengthened her resolve, and she knew she was finally ready to take the next steps. That evening, she submitted a formal report to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, detailing the findings of her preliminary investigation. She attached the testimonies, notes, and complaints, providing a comprehensive overview of Dr. Miller's long history of neglect and prejudice. She also recommended an inquiry into the hospital's board, suggesting they were complicit in covering up Dr. Miller's actions. As she hit send, Sandra felt a surge of determination. She knew this fight wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for it. As Sandra finalized her report, a knock at her hotel room door interrupted her thoughts. She crossed the room and opened the door to see her colleague Tom, standing there with a solemn expression. Tom had worked with Sandra for years and was one of the few people she trusted implicitly. "I came as soon as I could," he said, stepping inside and closing the door. "I saw your report come through. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" Sandra nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Absolutely. This is a pattern of negligence and discrimination, and it goes beyond Dr. Miller. The entire hospital administration seems complicit in protecting him." Tom exhaled slowly, his gaze intense. "You know the legal battles that come with these cases, right? This isn't just about negligence. It's about systemic bias. If we go forward, it could take years, and you'll have everyone from the hospital board to powerful lawyers trying to discredit your case." Sandra crossed her arms, her jaw set with determination. "These people have been protecting Dr. Miller for years, Tom. I've got testimony after testimony of patients ignored, lives endangered, all because of one man's prejudice and the board's silence. It might take years, but this is a fight worth having. I can't look away, not when I know what he's done." Tom watched her for a moment, nodding. "I've seen you take on difficult cases before, Sandra. I'll support you on this, but we need to be thorough, airtight. We're not just taking on Dr. Miller. We're challenging a system that's been protected by money, power, and influence. You ready for that?" Sandra's eyes didn't waver. "Absolutely. Let's do it." The next morning, Sandra and Tom headed to Memorial Hospital together. Armed with a subpoena for records, they intended to gather everything they could to strengthen their case. Upon arrival, they were greeted by hospital security, who led them to the administrative wing where Leslie Timmons was waiting. Leslie's face was tense, and her eyes darted nervously from Sandra to Tom. "Good morning, Agent Watson, Agent Thomas. I assume you're here for Dr. Miller's files and other sensitive materials." Sandra nodded, her expression firm. "Yes, we need full access to all personnel records, complaint files, and incident reports involving Dr. Miller and any patient care issues over the past 5 years. We'll also need to speak with any staff members who've worked under him in the ER." Leslie's face paled slightly. "We'll do our best to cooperate. The board, well, they're not pleased with the inquiry. They claim there's no evidence of any malpractice, but I've been instructed to provide you with the files you requested." She handed Sandra a thick folder, filled with reports that had been buried or dismissed over the years. Sandra flipped through the documents, her jaw tightening as she read complaint after complaint. Each report detailed cases of minority patients receiving delayed treatment, being misdiagnosed, or simply ignored. Many of the complaints were marked resolved with minimal documentation or explanation. "This is only a fraction of the evidence we need," Sandra said, looking up at Leslie. "There's an entire system here that's failed these patients, and someone's been covering it up." Leslie shifted uncomfortably. "I've tried to do what I could, Agent Watson, but Dr. Miller has friends on the board. It's nearly impossible to bring a formal complaint against him without facing backlash." Sandra's eyes narrowed. This is bigger than Dr. Miller, Leslie. It's about the hospital's responsibility to its patients. Every report in this folder is a life affected, a family endangered. And it's gone unchecked because no one's held him accountable. Leslie sighed, her shoulders sagging. Look, I want to help, but the board is already on edge. They're trying to keep this quiet, and if they find out I've been talking to you. Her voice trailed off, fear evident in her eyes. Sandra placed a hand on Leslie's shoulder. You don't have to go through this alone. We're going to bring this to light, and if you help us, we'll make sure your cooperation is documented. You have my word. Leslie nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you, Agent Watson. There's more I can tell you, but not here. I'll meet you at the coffee shop down the street after my shift ends. There's a lot you need to know. Sandra nodded, watching as Leslie hurried back down the hall. She knew they were up against a powerful force, but Leslie's willingness to speak was a promising start. Later that afternoon, Sandra and Tom sat in a small booth at the coffee shop, waiting for Leslie to arrive. The atmosphere was calm, a stark contrast to the tension at the hospital. Sandra felt the weight of the case pressing on her, the lives affected by years of neglect replaying in her mind. When Leslie finally arrived, she looked around cautiously before slipping into the booth across from them. She leaned forward, speaking in a hushed tone. There's a lot you don't know about Dr. Miller and the board. They're all connected, protecting each other. And it goes back years. Sandra and Tom listened intently as Leslie explained the inner workings of the hospital. She recounted stories of board meetings where complaints about Dr. Miller were dismissed without investigation, where discussions of keeping the hospital's reputation intact overshadowed patient safety. She revealed how Dr. Miller's father, a wealthy businessman and longtime hospital benefactor, had used his influence to protect his son from repercussions. Every time there was an incident, Leslie continued, they'd label it as a miscommunication or a documentation error. Complaints would disappear, and staff members who raised concerns would find themselves reassigned or pressured to keep quiet. Sandra's face hardened. So they've systematically silenced anyone who tried to hold Dr. Miller accountable. Leslie nodded, her expression one of resignation. I tried to file a formal complaint last year, but it was shut down before it reached the board. The same thing happened to 2 other staff members. They transferred one to a different hospital in the network, and the other was given a lower position. They make it clear, if you go against Dr. Miller, you're going against the board. Tom glanced at Sandra, his brow furrowed. This goes beyond medical malpractice. We're looking at systemic corruption and abuse of power. If the board has been covering for Dr. Miller all these years, they're just as liable. Sandra nodded. This is exactly what we need to bring forward. Leslie, your testimony will be crucial to the investigation. Are you willing to go on record with all of this? Leslie hesitated, fear evident in her eyes. If it means ending this, yes, I'm willing. But you have to understand, the board won't go down without a fight. They'll do everything they can to discredit this investigation. Sandra placed a reassuring hand on Leslie's. Thank you, Leslie. We'll protect you through this process. Your courage will help prevent this from happening to others. The next day, armed with Leslie's testimony and the records from the hospital, Sandra and Tom arranged to meet with the state medical board. They had secured an emergency meeting to present their findings, and Sandra could feel the weight of the moment as they entered the board's conference room. The board members sat around a large table, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The chairman, a tall man with graying hair, motioned for them to begin. Sandra took a deep breath and opened her laptop, displaying the documents they had gathered. We've initiated an investigation into Dr. Thomas Miller at Memorial Hospital. Over the past 5 years, there have been numerous complaints against Dr. Miller, all involving neglect or discriminatory behavior toward minority patients. Our evidence suggests that these complaints were systematically dismissed or buried. The chairman's brows knit together in concern. Agent Watson, are you suggesting that Memorial Hospital has been intentionally covering up incidents involving Dr. Miller? Sandra's gaze didn't waver. Yes, Chairman. Not only that, but we believe the board has been complicit in protecting him, prioritizing reputation over patient safety. We have testimony from hospital staff, as well as documentation of complaints that were ignored or dismissed. This is a matter of civil rights, and we're requesting the medical board's full cooperation in this investigation. A murmur rippled through the room, and several board members exchanged glances. The chairman tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table before speaking. This is a serious allegation, Agent Watson. If what you're saying is true, it will have significant repercussions for both the hospital and this board. Tom nodded. We understand, sir, but we believe this is necessary. Dr. Miller's actions have put lives at risk, and the hospital's failure to address these issues constitutes a breach of public trust. We're asking for your cooperation to ensure justice for these patients and to prevent future harm. The chairman leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. We'll need time to review these materials, but I'll notify the board immediately of your findings. If even a fraction of this is true, disciplinary action will be necessary. Sandra and Tom exchanged a relieved glance. It was a small step, but it was progress. As they left the conference room, Sandra felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be long, filled with legal battles and resistance, but they had begun the journey toward justice. Later that night, as Sandra sat by her aunt's hospital bed, she recounted the day's events to Carol, sharing the progress they had made. Carol's face softened with pride. Sandra, I knew you were strong, but you're giving people a voice. People like me who wouldn't have the courage to speak out. Sandra squeezed her aunt's hand gently. Aunt Carol, you're the reason I do this. You and everyone else who's been overlooked or mistreated. This isn't just about one doctor. It's about changing the system. Carol nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for fighting for us. Sandra stayed with her aunt long into the night, their hands clasped together as the weight of the journey ahead settled around them. She knew there were powerful forces at play, people who would stop at nothing to protect their own. But as she sat beside her aunt, she felt an unwavering resolve to see this fight through to the end. For her aunt, for every silenced patient, and for a world where justice and dignity prevailed. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting soft beams of light across Carol's bed as Sandra sat by her side. Carol looked more rested, her face showing signs of healing, though her shoulder was still immobilized in a sling. Sandra felt the familiar mix of relief and determination as she prepared for the next steps. The journey so far had been fraught with resistance, but every piece of evidence she gathered brought her closer to the truth, and closer to justice for her aunt and others who had suffered. Just as she finished jotting down notes on her laptop, her phone buzzed. It was Tom. Sandra, we need to talk. I've uncovered something big, he said, his tone urgent. Let's meet at the cafe by the hospital, Sandra replied, sensing the weight in his voice. I'll be there in 15 minutes. She squeezed her aunt's hand. Aunt Carol, I have to go, but I'll be back soon. Carol gave her a reassuring smile. Do what you need to do, Sandra. I'll be right here waiting. Sandra entered the cafe, spotting Tom in a secluded corner booth, a stack of documents in front of him. He looked up as she approached, and she could see the intensity in his eyes. What did you find? Sandra asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Tom leaned forward, lowering his voice. It's worse than we thought. Dr. Miller isn't the only one. I found a network of medical professionals, doctors, administrators, even a few board members who have actively suppressed malpractice claims for years. They've manipulated patient records, altered data, and buried complaints, all in the name of protecting the hospital's reputation. Sandra's heart raced as she took in his words. You're saying this goes beyond Dr. Miller? Tom nodded grimly. Yes, this is systemic. The hospital board is heavily invested in maintaining their image, and it looks like they've gone to great lengths to silence anyone who poses a threat. Dr. Miller's father was just the start. He funded a foundation that essentially acts as a shield for medical professionals under scrutiny. And it's not just Memorial. This network spans multiple hospitals in the region. Sandra sat back, the enormity of the revelation sinking in. So this isn't just a case of one doctor's misconduct. It's a web of corruption with lives on the line. Tom passed her a document, his expression dark. I found records of altered medical reports, especially in cases involving minority patients. These reports were edited to downplay symptoms, minimize treatment delays, and even erase certain complaints. In one case, a patient died due to misdiagnosed symptoms, and the family's complaint was written off as unsubstantiated because of a lack of evidence. And the same doctor, Dr. Miller. Sandra's stomach turned as she skimmed through the document. So this is how they've avoided liability. They've manipulated the records to show no wrongdoing and insulated themselves from any accountability. How do we even begin to dismantle something like this? Tom took a deep breath. We build a case strong enough that they can't ignore it. And we have to go public. Once we have enough evidence, we need to expose this corruption to the media and the public. This will force the board's hand and bring external pressure from regulators. But we have to be careful. They won't let this go without a fight. Sandra nodded, her mind racing. She was no stranger to complex cases, but this was unlike anything she'd encountered. She had expected resistance, maybe even a few attempts at intimidation. But a network of corruption protecting malpractice across multiple hospitals. This was a systemic nightmare. We need whistleblowers then. People who can back up the documentation with first-hand accounts. Sandra said, formulating a plan in her mind. If we can get testimonies from former employees, nurses, or anyone who's seen this corruption up close, we can build a solid case. Tom nodded. I've already reached out to a few contacts in other hospitals. There's one former nurse, Kelly Reyes, who was fired after raising concerns about patient neglect. She's agreed to meet with us. She said she has proof of record tampering from when she worked under Dr. Miller. Sandra's heart skipped a beat. Proof. If she has that, we could have a smoking gun. Exactly, Tom replied. But she's cautious. She's been intimidated before and isn't sure who she can trust. I assured her that we provide protection if she comes forward. Sandra set her jaw, feeling the weight of what they were about to undertake. Then let's meet her. We have to show her that she's safe and that her voice matters. The next afternoon, Sandra and Tom met Kelly Reyes in a small, dimly lit diner outside of town. Kelly, a petite woman with deep-set eyes and a wary expression, clutched her purse tightly as she slid into the booth across from them. She glanced around nervously, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for meeting with us, Kelly, Sandra said, offering her a reassuring smile. We know this isn't easy, but what you have could be pivotal in bringing justice to so many. Kelly nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she opened her purse. She pulled out a stack of documents, each one filled with handwritten notes, dates, and patient case numbers. I kept these from my time at Memorial, Kelly said, her voice shaky. I didn't want to just walk away, knowing what I saw. These are patient records I noticed being changed. Symptoms downplayed, delays erased. I reported it to HR, but they told me to mind my own business. 2 weeks later, I was let go for budgetary reasons. Sandra took the documents, flipping through the pages, her eyes narrowing as she read. These are clear cases of record tampering. This is exactly what we need to prove that Dr. Miller, and possibly others, have systematically altered records to cover up malpractice. Kelly looked down, her voice growing softer. It's not just about what they did to me. I'm worried about the patients who suffered because of it. I remember one case, a young black mother, no older than 25. She came in with severe pain, but Dr. Miller said she was exaggerating. By the time they took her seriously, it was too late. She lost her life. Sandra's heart tightened. I'm so sorry, Kelly. I know it must be painful to remember these things, but your courage in coming forward is invaluable. We're building the case, and your testimony could make all the difference." Kelly glanced up, her expression fierce yet haunted. "I just want them to pay for what they did. No one deserves to go through that. And no one deserves to lose a loved one because some doctor decided they weren't worth his time." Sandra nodded, taking Kelly's hand in a gesture of solidarity. "We're going to make sure they face justice, Kelly. Your bravery will help protect so many others from suffering the same fate." With Kelly's documents in hand, Sandra and Tom returned to the FBI office, where they began piecing together their case. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly, cataloging every complaint, every altered record, and every incident of delayed care. Sandra felt the case expanding beyond what she could have anticipated. What had begun as an effort to seek justice for her aunt was turning into a full-blown expose of systemic corruption. As they finalized their case file, Sandra received a call from a hospital board member, Roger Kinsey, who had heard about the investigation. His voice was polite, but veiled with subtle threat. "Agent Watson," he began smoothly, "I understand you're looking into some unfortunate incidents involving Dr. Miller. Let me assure you, the hospital has always prioritized patient care. However, I'd like to propose a settlement for your aunt's case. Should that be acceptable?" Sandra's jaw tightened as she listened, recognizing his attempt to defuse the situation with hush money. "Mr. Kinsey, my aunt's case is only part of a much larger issue. This isn't about a settlement. It's about accountability and justice for every patient affected by Dr. Miller's negligence." There was a long silence on the other end. "I understand your sentiment, Agent Watson, but you must understand the implications. A public investigation could tarnish the hospital's reputation irreparably, not to mention the livelihoods at stake." Sandra's voice was steely as she replied, "Mr. Kinsey, if the hospital cared as much about the patients as you do about its reputation, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I'll see you in court." She hung up, her resolve stronger than ever. They were closing in on the truth, and no amount of intimidation or offers of settlement would deter her. The following week, Sandra submitted her case to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, her compiled evidence bolstered by Kelly's testimony, and the documents exposing record tampering. A full investigation was authorized, with Sandra leading the charge alongside Tom. As news of the investigation spread, more former hospital employees came forward, each with stories that echoed Kelly's experiences. Nurses, junior doctors, and administrative staff described a culture of intimidation and silence, with Dr. Miller at the center. The story gained traction in the local media, and public outrage began to build as more patients came forward with their own experiences of mistreatment. For Carol, watching the news from her hospital bed, it was a bittersweet vindication. She had never wanted to be the center of a scandal, but as she saw the bravery of others coming forward, she felt a quiet pride in her niece. On the day the formal investigation was launched, Sandra visited her aunt, bringing flowers and a quiet smile. "It's happening, Aunt Carol," Sandra said, sitting beside her. "The investigation's official. They'll be held accountable for every life they endangered." Carol took her niece's hand, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've done something remarkable, Sandra. For me, for everyone. Thank you." Sandra nodded, the weight of the fight still heavy on her, but tempered with the knowledge that justice was finally within reach. The investigation into Dr. Miller and Memorial Hospital had become a whirlwind, drawing national attention and putting a spotlight on the medical field's hidden biases. Sandra's phone buzzed constantly, flooded with calls from journalists, lawyers, and even patients who share horror stories about their experiences with Dr. Miller and other doctors like him. As the public's outrage grew, so did Sandra's resolve to see the case through to the end. Her once small inquiry had blossomed into a powerful movement for justice, challenging an entire system of neglect and prejudice. The day of the first court hearing finally arrived. Sandra sat beside her attorney, Dan Mercer, a civil rights lawyer renowned for his work on high-profile cases involving racial discrimination. Dan was a towering figure with a reputation for being relentless in court. He'd reviewed Sandra's evidence meticulously, preparing arguments designed to expose the full extent of the corruption at Memorial Hospital. "Are you ready for this, Agent Watson?" Dan asked, his voice calm but piercing. Sandra nodded. "More than ready. This isn't just about my aunt anymore. It's about everyone who's been ignored, dismissed, or neglected. This trial has to mean something." Dan gave her an approving nod. "Good. The truth is on our side. And we have solid evidence. Remember, the defense will try to make this seem like an isolated incident, a case of misunderstanding or overzealousness, but we're not letting them play that card. We're going to show how deep this runs." They were soon ushered into the courtroom, where rows of reporters, activists, and community members filled the benches. On the opposite side sat Dr. Miller, stoic and defiant, flanked by a team of expensive defense lawyers. His expression was unreadable, but Sandra noticed the faint sneer when he saw her enter. She held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. The proceedings began with opening statements, the defense attorneys quickly framing the situation as a misunderstanding of hospital protocol. They insisted Dr. Miller's treatment of Carol had nothing to do with her race, that he had merely followed the hospital's triage policy and was simply overwhelmed on a busy night. The lawyers painted Dr. Miller as a dedicated doctor unfairly targeted in a public witch hunt. But as Sandra's attorney began his cross-examination, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted. Dan had a commanding presence, his questions piercing and direct as he led Dr. Miller's colleagues and hospital board members through a series of uncomfortable truths. "Dr. Miller, let's discuss your treatment record," Dan began, his voice steady and unyielding. "How would you explain the fact that over 70% of complaints filed against you came from minority patients?" Dr. Miller's jaw tightened. "That's a coincidence. These are difficult cases, and sometimes patients misinterpret standard procedures. We deal with high-stress situations, and not everyone understands that." "Coincidence?" Dan echoed, raising an eyebrow. "In the last 5 years alone, there have been over 30 complaints, each documenting delayed care, misdiagnosis, or outright neglect, and they all involve minority patients. Can you explain that?" Dr. Miller shifted uncomfortably. "Look, emergency medicine is complex. Some cases just don't go the way we want." Dan's voice sharpened. "And you expect us to believe that all these cases, all these complaints, are merely coincidental? That the experiences of minority patients don't warrant a closer look?" Dr. Miller looked to his attorney, but Dan continued pressing, refusing to let him deflect. "The truth, Dr. Miller, is that your behavior isn't just coincidence or misunderstanding. It's a pattern of neglect, a gross misuse of medical authority to endanger lives. We have documented evidence from staff, altered medical records, and tampered reports that prove it." As Dan spoke, Sandra felt a sense of vindication. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on Dr. Miller as he squirmed under the pressure. Dan turned to the judge, presenting printed copies of Kelly Rice's records, each showing discrepancies in symptoms, response times, and treatment methods. The defense lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the evidence, seeing its relevance to the case. When Kelly took the stand, her voice shook but held firm as she recounted her time working under Dr. Miller. She described the night shifts, the neglected patients, the altered records, all in harrowing detail. Her voice cracked as she told the court about patients who had begged for help, only to be ignored because Dr. Miller had decided their pain wasn't real. "There was one patient," Kelly said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was in severe pain, clutching her abdomen, crying. Dr. Miller told her it was probably nothing and left her waiting for hours. By the time someone took her to surgery, she had already pulled out. We couldn't save her." A gasp rippled through the courtroom, and Sandra felt tears sting her eyes. That young woman had lost her life because of a doctor's disregard, because no one had seen her as someone worth saving. It was a moment of painful truth, and the weight of it settled over everyone present. The defense lawyer attempted to discredit Kelly's testimony, pointing out that she'd been fired from the hospital. But Kelly stood her ground, calmly explaining how she'd been retaliated against for speaking out, how every time she'd raised concerns, she'd been shut down. When it was Sandra's turn to testify, she recounted her experiences with her aunt, detailing the sequence of events with precision and emotion. She described how Carol had been left unattended, ignored despite her visible injuries, how the doctor had prioritized a minor injury over her aunt's serious condition. She spoke with the conviction of someone who had seen the truth, who had fought to expose it. Throughout her testimony, Sandra kept her gaze steady, refusing to look away from Dr. Miller. She wanted him to understand the gravity of his actions, to feel the weight of the lives he'd affected. And as she spoke, she noticed a shift in the courtroom, a sense of shared outrage, a collective demand for justice. By the time the closing statements were delivered, it was clear that the case had resonated deeply with everyone in the room. Dan stood before the jury, his tone impassioned yet measured. "This isn't just about negligence," he said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "It's about the lives that were shattered because one doctor saw certain patients as less deserving of care. It's about the families left behind, the mothers, fathers, and children who lost loved ones because of a prejudice that should have no place in our society." He paused, letting his words sink in. Dr. Miller's actions were protected by a system that valued reputation over responsibility, that turned a blind eye to injustice for the sake of convenience. But today, we have a chance to say, no more. We have the opportunity to set a precedent, to show that every life, no matter the color of their skin or their background, is valuable. We ask you to stand with us in seeking justice for the people who were denied it. When the jury retired to deliberate, Sandra felt a surge of both hope and anxiety. She knew they had presented a strong case, but the outcome was still uncertain. She held her aunt's hand tightly, drawing strength from her presence. Hours later, the jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces solemn. The judge called for silence, and Sandra held her breath as the foreman read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Dr. Thomas Miller, guilty of gross negligence and discriminatory malpractice." A wave of relief and satisfaction washed over Sandra as the words settled in. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Dr. Miller's face paled, his expression one of shock and disbelief. His defense team sat in stunned silence, realizing that they'd lost not just a case, but the shield of impunity they'd built over years. The judge ordered Dr. Miller's medical license revoked and ruled that he would face civil penalties as well as disciplinary action. The court's decision sent a powerful message that no one, regardless of their connections or influence, was above accountability. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of supporters had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for all" and "Every life matters." Reporters swarmed Sandra and her team as they exited, each vying for a statement, a quote, a reaction to the landmark ruling. Sandra stepped forward, addressing the crowd with a quiet dignity. "Today is a victory not just for my aunt or the patients Dr. Miller neglected, but for everyone who has ever felt unseen, unheard, or unworthy. This ruling is a reminder that justice is possible, that every life holds value, and that we must hold accountable those who fail to uphold that truth." As she spoke, she saw her aunt standing nearby, her eyes filled with pride and love. Carol had been through so much, but today she stood tall, knowing that her pain had not been in vain, that her story had sparked a change that would ripple through the medical community. The aftermath of the trial led to a full audit of Memorial Hospital's practices, uncovering further instances of negligence and misconduct. Several board members resigned, and new protocols were implemented to ensure that every patient received fair treatment. The case became a benchmark, inspiring hospitals across the country to reevaluate their policies and confront biases within their systems. In the months that followed, Sandra continued her work, taking on cases that championed the underrepresented, the overlooked, the marginalized. Her fight for justice became a lifelong mission, and each time she faced a new challenge, she remembered her aunt's resilience, her courage, and the victory they had achieved together. One evening, as she visited Carol at her home, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. Carol turned to Sandra, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Sandra, you didn't just fight for me. You fought for everyone who was made to feel invisible. I'm so proud of you. Sandra smiled, squeezing her aunt's hand. I couldn't have done it without you, Aunt Carol. You taught me to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it is. And that's something I'll carry with me forever. As they sat together, the sky awash in colors of twilight, Sandra felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been arduous, but it had led to a place of justice and healing. And as she looked out over the horizon, she knew that her fight was far from over, but she was ready, more determined than ever, to make a difference.